Have you ever met someone online and wondered if they were really who they claimed to be? For millions of people, dating apps have become a normal part of everyday life. A swipe, a message, a first date, and sometimes a second. Most of the time, nothing unusual happens. But in 2017, a young woman from Nebraska went on a second date, arranged through Tinder. She never came home. What began as a missing person case would soon become one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in recent American history. An investigation involving deception, false identities, a nationwide search, and two suspects whose bizarre behavior would shock investigators. This is the true story of Sydney Loofe. In November of 2017, Sydney Loofe was 24 years old and living in Lincoln, Nebraska. Friends described her as kind, energetic, and full of life. She loved animals. She enjoyed spending time with family and friends. And, like many young adults, she was exploring the world of online dating. At the time, dating apps were becoming increasingly popular. For people living in smaller communities, they offered opportunities to meet individuals they otherwise might never encounter. Sydney had recently matched with a woman who identified herself as Audrey. The two began communicating. Their conversations appeared friendly. Eventually, they agreed to meet in person. Their first date seemed to go well. Sydney even shared positive comments about it with friends. There appeared to be no reason for concern. A second date was planned, and on November 15, 2017, Sydney left to meet Audrey once again. It would be the last time her loved ones saw her alive. When Sydney failed to show up for work the following day, concern quickly turned into alarm. This wasn't normal behavior. Family members tried contacting her. Friends reached out. Messages went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. As hours passed, fear began to grow. Soon, a missing person investigation was underway. At first, investigators examined the usual possibilities. Had Sydney left voluntarily? Had she experienced an accident? Was there some other explanation? But as detectives looked closer, troubling details started to emerge. The woman known as Audrey wasn't exactly who she appeared to be, and that discovery would change everything. As investigators traced phone records, social media activity, and digital evidence, they identified the person behind the profile. The woman was actually Bailey Boswell, and she wasn't alone. Closely connected to her was a man named Aubrey Trail. As detectives dug deeper into the pair's backgrounds, they found a history of criminal activity, deception, and manipulation. The investigation was becoming increasingly disturbing, and the public was paying attention. Because now there were real fears that Sydney had not simply disappeared. She had become the victim of a crime. Then something happened that stunned both investigators and the public. Instead of remaining hidden, the suspects began posting videos online. In the videos, they claimed they were innocent. They denied harming Sydney. Yet their unusual behavior only intensified public suspicion. As law enforcement agencies worked to track their movements, the couple traveled across state lines. The case was now attracting national attention. The FBI joined the investigation, and the search for Sydney entered a critical stage. The question everyone wanted answered was becoming painfully simple. Where was Sydney Loofe, and what had happened to her? As investigators intensified their search, they began piecing together Sydney's final known movements, phone records, surveillance footage, witness statements, digital messages. Every clue mattered. Every minute mattered. The more detectives learned about Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail, the more concerned they became. According to investigators, the pair had spent years moving from place to place. People who encountered them often described being drawn into their lives through promises, manipulation, and deception. Some would later tell investigators that the couple had attempted to recruit them into what appeared to be a strange hierarchy controlled by Aubrey Trail. Others described feeling intimidated or pressured. At the time, however, investigators were focused on one thing: finding Sydney. Days turned into weeks. The search expanded. Volunteers distributed flyers. Friends organized search efforts. Social media users across the country shared Sydney's photograph. Hope remained that she would be found alive. But investigators were beginning to fear the worst. Then, as authorities continued tracking the movements of Boswell and Trail, they uncovered evidence suggesting the pair had traveled through rural areas of Nebraska shortly after Sydney disappeared. Cell phone data, vehicle records, surveillance footage. Each piece added another layer to the investigation. And gradually, the picture became clearer. On December 4, 2017, nearly 3 weeks after Sydney vanished, investigators made a devastating discovery. Human remains were located in a remote area of Clay County, Nebraska. The remains were later identified as Sydney Loofe. The news devastated her family. For weeks they had searched, hoped, prayed. Now they had their answer. But they still did not know exactly why this had happened or what role Boswell and Trail had played. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. Prosecutors began building a case against the two suspects. As evidence accumulated, investigators alleged that Sydney's death was not accidental. Instead, they argued it had been planned. The prosecution would later present evidence suggesting that Sydney had been deliberately targeted and lured through deception. The Tinder profile that introduced her to Bailey Boswell had become a central part of the case. According to prosecutors, the online relationship was the first step in a carefully orchestrated plan. As the case moved toward trial, even more disturbing allegations emerged. Several women came forward with stories about Boswell and Trail. Some testified that they had been recruited into what they described as a bizarre and manipulative environment created by the couple. The testimony painted a picture of control, intimidation, and psychological influence. While each account differed, prosecutors argued that together they helped explain the world surrounding the two defendants, a world that investigators believed ultimately led to Sydney's death. Then came one of the most dramatic moments of the entire case. During court proceedings, Aubrey Trail repeatedly drew attention through unusual behavior and outbursts. At one point, proceedings were interrupted after a shocking incident in the courtroom. The event generated national headlines and further intensified public interest in the trial. For many observers, the courtroom drama only reinforced how unusual the case had become. But behind the headlines was a much more important reality. A young woman had lost her life, and her family was still waiting for justice. As prosecutors presented their evidence, they argued that the murder had been deliberate and premeditated. Defense attorneys challenged those allegations. Jurors listened to weeks of testimony. Experts took the stand. Witnesses recounted their experiences. Investigators described how they had pieced together the timeline. And gradually, the jury was asked to answer the question at the center of the case. Were Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail responsible for Sydney Loofe's murder? Eventually, the verdicts arrived. Aubrey Trail was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Bailey Boswell was also convicted. For Sydney's family, the verdicts represented a measure of justice after years of pain and uncertainty. The legal process had finally reached its conclusion, but nothing could undo what had happened. Nothing could bring Sydney back. Today, the case remains one of the most discussed criminal investigations in Nebraska's history. Not only because of the shocking details, not only because of the unusual behavior of the suspects, but because it serves as a reminder of how quickly an ordinary decision can change everything. A second date, a familiar app, a person who seemed trustworthy, and a chain of events that ended in tragedy. For those who knew Sydney, however, the story is about much more than a crime. It is about a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams, plans, and a future. Someone whose life was taken far too soon. And that is how many believe she should be remembered. Not for the circumstances of her death, but for the life she lived. Because behind every headline, behind every investigation, and behind every courtroom verdict, There is a real person whose story deserves to be told.